The Brussels Report podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Pieter Cleppe. I'm the editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport.eu, and I'm really happy to have as my guest today Björn Peters. Björn is a German physicist. He's an energy economist. He has been working at McKinsey, Deutsche Börse, Deutsche Bank. He's a prolific writer, a political commentator, has played quite a big role in the German nuclear energy debate. And he's just not only a commentator, he's also an entrepreneur. He's very much in the field at the moment. He's busy with the new generation of nuclear power plants. So that's super interesting to hear his thoughts. So welcome, Björn.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. So let's maybe start with this tiny political issue that's keeping some people awake, the energy crisis that has engulfed Europe. I think you can say over the last year. I mean, it's definitely started before Putin invaded Ukraine. So in a nutshell, what is the cause of this energy crisis?
Well, as you rightly said, it started in the first half of 2021. And the Ukraine crisis, of course, amplified it, but it was not the root cause. The root cause is policy-driven in two regards or two dimensions. One is that we made ourselves more and more reliable, dependent on unreliable sources of energy, so weather-dependent energy forms. And unfortunately, across several regions of the world, the nature didn't play with us very well. So we had substantial less wind power in Western Europe in the first half of 2021. Hence, what do people do? They rather burn gas and switch the gas power plants up in order to get the power they need. And in Brazil, it was a drought, so they had less hydropower than usually. And again, they were using more gas. So the gas markets were under stress. And it's more than a year. I gave an interview. I remember that I said, well, we are in an energy crisis. Prices have doubled and tripled. And not only the gas prices have tripled. At the time, it was the carbon markets as well that had went up due to additional demand. So that was number one root cause. And in the number two was the defund movement going out of Wall Street a couple of years ago. So the defund fossil fuel companies, because what would healthy fossil fuel companies do when demand increases? They increase supply, but they didn't have the funds to do so, and therefore this is another issue for that we're now facing, that we need more fossil fuels to cover up for the bad weather, and we don't get these additional supplies.
So because of ESG, the second reason, right?
Yeah, it's part of the ESG criteria, but I think it's a little bit broader. This defund fossil fuels is much more severe. So it is not about women's right or social justice or whatever. It's really that people believe we can phase out fossil fuels very quickly, and they might ignore that we still use 80% of them to fuel the world. And so they are here to stay for a while. And if we overcome them, it's not about policy, it's really about new technologies and innovation in other sectors.
And on fossil fuels, before we go to nuclear, on fossil fuels, it always struck me that, okay, let's assume you're somebody who wants to phase out fossil fuels in Europe. Then I would say the obvious thing to do is to start with phasing out non-European fossil fuels, and then after that, phase out European fossil fuels. I mean, not only because of supply certainty. I mean, we've seen with Russia how certain it is, but also I'm sure that gas extraction in the Netherlands is way better for the environment, despite its downsides, than it is in Russia or Qatar, right? So I mean, the Greens really have gotten away with this, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They are exporting environmental pollution,
Mm,
and that's certainly a bad thing. So, in Germany, in particular, I mean, we have since more than 20 years, we have a systematic political strategy shared by essentially by all parties that have been in government since then, to increase the cost of energy, and that has driven out substantial amounts of industry, of energy intense industry, to countries with less energy costs and probably less environmental standards.
mm.
So we are, therefore, if you think on a global scale, I believe we have harmed the planet with our policies and didn't do anything for the better.
Yes, absolutely. Now, as they say in the United Kingdom, we are where we are, not in a good place, I would say. But like, how to solve this? Now, let's say if you would be in charge, or if you would recommend to policymakers concrete steps to fix this, what would be your recommendation?
Actually, it's relatively simple when you think carefully about it. High prices mean high scarcity. That is very trivial, and it works in every market.
Mm,
And so if there is high scarcity, we need to increase supply. And what is the very first thing we can do to increase supply? That is not switching off reliable capacity. And I believe in Belgium there is a phase out debate about nuclear energy. Of course,
yes.
we do have one in Germany. We still have only three nuclear power plants running.
Hmm.
Three other could be brought back to operations with modest amounts of effort.
Hmm.
So that is something that could work very quickly, and that has to be done. So it's totally irresponsible not to discuss it and
Mm,
not to do it. Then, of course, what is happening, and that's the response of the German government currently, is to switch on coal more and more in lignite plants, bring them back, which is much more pollutant than nuclear energy.
mm,
And so these are the short-term measures. The mid-term measures is, of course, start producing our own gas. So
hmm.
for Germany, that would mean we have about 30 years of supply in our soils. So we could extract this gas, but it's
Hmm.
forbidden by law to do fracking in Germany. And
Fracking,
exactly
yeah.
as you said, fracking in Germany has been done for decades without any issue.
Mm.
If you want to rely on somebody to do fracking, it should be a German engineer. Um,
I
so
didn't
sorry.
know that. I did not know that fracking was actually legal in Germany.
It is illegal to do
Yes,
it.
but I did
Yes.
not know that it used to be perfectly legal. Right? That's what you're saying,
Absolutely,
or
but
yes?
fracking is nothing really new. I mean,
Hmm.
some forms of fracking have been done since the 1960s,
Okay.
so it's certainly older than me. Um, and um, so this is on a midterm. We could develop within a few years those domestic sources of fossil
Hmm.
fuels again
Also
in a
in the
time.
Netherlands, Groningen, the biggest
Absolutely.
gas field in Europe, one of the biggest in the world, and the Dutch government is afraid to even discuss it because they completely mishandled this, the damages that people suffered. And now everybody is against it, but they should just, I think, properly compensate people for the damage and then do it in a proper way. And well, anyway, um,
Yeah. No, I mean it is a similar discussion in fracking, in gas fracking, than in the nuclear industry. People um, lead those discussions, participate in those discussions with arguments from the 1980s.
mm,
But on the other side, gas fracking technologies have improved largely. So There is no toxic substances any longer in the fracking substances, and the with the double shelling of the boreholes, it has never happened so far in history that there was damage to the groundwaters, and insofar fracking is a totally different technology now than it used to be 30 years ago when people were getting upset about it, and probably rightfully so. So there is technical progress, there is innovation, and it's for the better, and we should use it.
Well, fascinating, because I think very few people actually know a lot about this in the public debate. It's sort of vilified, and yeah, like there's very little nuance when it comes to fracking. What would you say? You mentioned the short term, the midterm, and then the long term. What's the long term approach?
Well, the long term approach is either to develop or to invent those miraculous storage systems that people are waiting for since decades.
Hmm.
And it has to be really cost efficient and energy efficient. So everything that is currently proposed is highly inefficient. So
Hmm.
you, for example, with this green hydrogen bubble,
Yeah.
I don't think it will really come because it's you. So when you produce power somehow, use the power to produce hydrogen, store
Mm.
it, compress it, then dig it out from somewhere again when you once you use it, once
Yeah.
you need it, and put it into a power station again. Um, then you lose essentially 80% of that energy, of the initial energy. So if energy is extremely cheap, then you can afford it. But of course, with the weather dependent energy sources, it won't be that cheap because we are here in Europe and we don't have 4,000 hours of solar irradiation
Mm.
over the year. So that is probably something we have to overcome. So this type of thinking that renewable energy is a value in itself,
Hmm.
um, that is something that has deeply flawed the all the discussion. Because we started with renewable energy because we wanted a cleaner and a carbon-free energy production, but whether it really is cleaner, with given all the toxic waste issues and the
Mm.
enormous commodity issues and the
Yeah.
land issues, so if it's not environmental friendly, then we need to reconsider. And it didn't pose really big issues so far because we didn't have much of it.
Hmm.
But to continue on such a path and say, well, 100% of energy should come from weather dependent energy sources, it is, of course, it would transform, industrialize the continent in a way that hasn't been conceived ever before. And I don't think that people will accept this. So we, not all of us are living in big towns, and we don't we know wind power plants only from the TV or so.
Yeah.
Some people have to live in those
Yes.
landscapes. So I think we have seen the peak of renewable energy now, and maybe it will probably continue a few years more. But more and more people in the globally wake up and reconsider the role of weather dependent energy sources. Um, and so the 10 years ago, I was in my when I gave talks about energy policy, it was titled "How much solar and wind can the German market tolerate?" So
Hmm.
it is actually a question of how much is good, and when does it get harmful.
Mm.
And this type of thinking is starting to evolve in many countries, and not so much at the center in the mainstream discussions yet in Europe. But as I've been discussing with North American and African people in the last months,
Mm.
and it is a very important consideration there. And then, of course, there is a very high level of innovation in the nuclear sector currently,
Yes.
um, and and this will create, so as soon as a nuclear power plant is as easy to operate than an X-ray machine, um, and as soon as it is cheaper than coal, oil, and gas, um, people will see nuclear energy totally different from nowadays. And I believe that the future of nuclear energy is yet to come.
And is it? I mean, like not opponents, but some people have rightly pointed out that, of course, nuclear energy produces electricity, but for some industrial processes, you need primary energy, basically. So is that correct that you can't, you can't rely for 100% of your energy supply on nuclear? You always will need some gas, coal, or would you say no? Maybe in the future, or that's not the case?
I know for sure. I mean,
Layman question.
that yeah, there are about 90 startups currently, or more or
Mm,
less startups. Some of them are quite mature, actually.
mm,
Companies globally who develop new nuclear, and some of them work with high temperature concepts.
mhm,
So that's the pebble bed people, and so X Energy, and it's the molten salt people like
mhm,
Moltex, and us with dual fluid. So we're working with liquid uranium even. Um, with high temperature heat, the energy landscape will be transformed enormously as soon as this is cheaper than gas and oil and coal. It will be built a little bit everywhere to fuel industrial processes, so it's for metal, glass, and cement production, for example,
So, sorry to
and
interrupt. You're saying that indeed nuclear is able to, on the long term, outcompete gas, oil. That's what you're saying?
yeah, but let me just finish the one sentence.
Sure.
So with heat, with an abundancy of industrial, so high temperature heat, you can even produce synfuels in arbitrary quantities. So we could stick with the infrastructure of combustion engines, and airplanes and all this. So we
Hmm.
wouldn't necessarily need fossil fuels for this, and it could be very clean burning fuels that really change the way people think the environment is harmed. And so back to your question.
Mm.
I mean, um, there are various concepts out there that are currently pursued. Some of them produce very efficiently power, but not really the high temperature heat, and others that produce more power, more the focus on the heat sector, because of their higher temperature in the reactors. What
Mm.
is currently going on with the SMRs, so the small and modular reactors business, um, it is that many of those companies focus enormously on introducing industrial manufacturing processes that haven't been seen before in the nuclear industry. One colleague put it very concisely. We in the industry, we used to build airports, but now we need to learn how to build aircrafts, and that is something we many companies are really working on, and of course with the industrial manufacturing process, you get down costs quite drastically, and with very simple reactor designs, you reduce operations cost and the maybe even the operation burden. So if you have something that works as simple as an X-ray machine, so every dentist can operate it. He doesn't need to be a nuclear engineer to do so, and
Mm.
eventually nuclear power plants or nuclear cores. Nuclear the core of a nuclear power station is a nuclear oven, and if these nuclear ovens are simple enough that they can be and safe enough that they can be put in every industrial zone, and people don't have to fear it, um, large parts of the industry actually can be decarbonized.
Okay, and if I understand you well, it's not just about avoiding CO2 emission. It's also about replacing gas, oil, maybe even coal as energy sources. Correct. So I would then expect people that care for the environment to be fanatically pro-nuclear. Correct.
Theoretically, yes, yeah, but and unfortunately, there are some misconceptions. I mean, nuclear energy has had the unfortunate fate of being invented in 1938, I believe, by Lise Meitner,
Mm.
a German physicist, and that was just before World War II, and people needed the nuclear reaction for building bombs instead of
Yes.
using it peacefully, and that has of course dragged the entire nuclear history down. But let's face it, that's 80 years ago. We need to look forward, and
Yes.
people are doing this. So it's an enormously innovative sector. I've been on many conferences this year and last year, and I've spoken with C-level colleagues from all sorts of nuclear companies, and so there's really good enthusiasm in this industry that we can collectively really solve the big energy issues that we're facing.
And just to go back to 8 years ago, anyway, this Lise Meitner, right? So, like, is nuclear technology? Is it? Does it have civilian origins or military origins? Just for the sake of the debate of whether the military brings about innovation or not.
Um, well, the scientific discovery was neither nor, of course. It was
Mm.
just the discovery that you could induce the fission of a nuclear core with neutrons. That was, of course, a purely scientific invention.
Mm.
Um, I think it is fair to say that not only the bomb, but even the first years of the civil usage of nuclear energy, it was mostly financed by the U.S. military in the West.
Hmm.
Um, there was not the same story in Germany, for example. We developed our nuclear industry a little later, so it didn't start in the 50s. It started, yeah, or maybe end of the 50s, while it was late 40s in the essentially immediately after World War II that they started with this in the US. So we were 10 years late, maybe. But the core really was excellent research and development conditions that only a military environment can could ground at the time.
Sure, sure. Interesting. And today you're talking about this, fascinating developments of, SMRs and small nuclear reactors that would basically could be in everybody's home, or that could be very decentralized. So is European industry and German industry? I mean, are we running behind the rest of the world, or are we actually? Do we have many companies active in this field?
Well, there are a number of very innovative companies in Europe. Take Seaborg and Copenhagen Atomics in Copenhagen, obviously.
Mm.
Um, and I like very much what Rolls-Royce is doing because they know how to build airplanes, or at least engines, airplane engines.
Mm.
So they have lots of manufacturing abilities, although their reactor design is so. Most nuclear engineers don't like it. I've met don't like it because it's so boring, it's so outdated. But
Mm.
actually, it's I think this is a good idea to use something to do something that is very well known, and to bring it to an industrial scale by a company like Rolls Royce. So I think this is a convincing concept. Um, so us in so it's mostly dominant a German team in that invented dual fluid energy. We went to Canada because we thought the development process will be easier there. It would probably be insane to develop a nuclear reactor in a country that forbids its usage. So it would be too much a risk to rely on politicians to
Yes.
keep the conditions positive. But most of the startups in that domain are actually in North America, in Canada and the US. There are very good government programs. In the US, for example, it's really, by the way, bipartisan efforts. So Democrats and Republicans are unified behind those programs, and they pour a few billions into this sector. And in order to help people um, bring forward their inventions in a good way, and make them progress. There's other debates about, for example, the nuclear fuel, that where the Department of Energy in the US is really helping in a way that we don't see in Europe.
Okay. Well, I can say in Belgium we have a research center that is quite known, Mira,
Mhm.
and they are also supported by the same Belgian government that is that at least used to try to shut down Belgium's nuclear fleet. But thankfully they're gonna at least keep 2 reactors out of the 7 open, and most likely more. That's more or less decided. But they have to, agree with owner Engie to bring that about. So anyway, very interesting to hear about the developments in the nuclear industry. And maybe I want to go back to one point you mentioned. For the long term, your great hopes are not only on nuclear but also on storage technology. And you were quite critical on green hydrogen, which is of course supported fanatically by the European Commission. But if you like, what would you be optimistic about when we're talking about storage? What kind of technologies do you think carry great hope?
Well, actually, to be precise, I said you have to have much hope into storage in order to really believe in it.
Oh, I see. I see.
So I I don't see many of those storage technologies, actually any single one that could compete on cost sufficiently. But that doesn't mean that I think that the hydrogen as an idea is dead. Um, as long as you produce it locally where you use it, hydrogen can play a very beneficial role, or if you produce higher molecules, something like methanol would be nice, ammonia would be nice, hydrazine. So once you have an high temperature oven, you can actually produce lots of those different energy commodities at large scale. But in particular for hydrogen, storage and the transport is very costly and inefficient. So therefore, it's, as I said. So it's better. It will have a good future if we learn to produce it locally and use it essentially immediately.
Well, in any case, if the nuclear technology revolution takes off, then I guess we have to worry less about storage, right?
Absolutely, a little bit will always be there, of course. I mean, even in the best times of 20 25 years ago of take the German grid because it's the largest one. Um, we still had some pumped hydropower plants for the peak demand, and that makes a lot of sense to run such storage plants. But it's a question of dimension. I mean, I calculated 10 years ago the overall challenge of switching from an energy system just a power system with dispatchable capacities to one that is entirely weather dependent, so only solar and wind energy, the storage requirement is about 80 terawatt hours, and our pumped hydro is 0.04 terawatt hours. So it's a factor of 2,000 away of what is actually needed. And of course, storage is only one solution to the right question, which is how do you bring this flexibility into the market? But so I don't see it. So all the studies I've read about that claim that such a 100% renewable energy scenario is possible, they were, every time I read it, there were significant flaws in the scientific thinking, in the scientific method involved, so that doesn't give me great courage in believing that this could ever be achieved. But on the other side, solar and wind energy is not too expensive in some regions, and I think it is there to stay. In particular, solar energy, because there's still a good cost digression, although only on LCOE, so that's the output cost on corporate level. So from of the power plant, it doesn't count for the system cost. But in regions where you have higher power demand when the sun is shining,
Yes.
It absolutely makes sense to have some solar energy in the grid. It's really here to stay, and it will be relatively cheap. It's only these systems of solar and storage and if it's more than 2 hours of storage, is if it's really the required levels of storage, which means weeks of storage. That is something that can't be built, and I'm pretty sure not within this century, not within the next one.
And actually, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because this is good to discuss among people that are interested in technological development or in profit or entrepreneurial opportunities in the energy sector. Super interesting, but at the end of the day, it should not matter for politicians. Politicians should not try to micromanage and try to favor one technology over another. They should not, I think, try to favor nuclear power over solar panels, or the other way around, or have minimum percentages of production with renewables. Right, and isn't that part of the problem, that especially the European Commission, of course, at the EU level, tries to not only tell countries to reduce CO2 emission, but also try to micromanage, try to tell them how to do it with minimum percentages of renewables, where it's very shady also what's defined as renewables, like burning wood imported from Brazil is defined as renewable energy, and in endless debates. And now that the Commission is sort of seeing, oh, well, the kind of technologies that we're supporting are unreliable, they then have their magic bullet storage, to solve the problem, which is then supposedly green hydrogen, which is, as you've explained, a bit of a pipe dream, or at least a bet. Maybe I guess we should be modest. Maybe it turns out to be right, but then if they have been making like massive bets with or welfare, even if the technologies politicians have been favoring turn out to be the superior ones, looking back, you could say it still was not the right thing to do, to gamble with people's welfare in such a way, right? So isn't that the problem, that this whole top-down approach towards energy, and also then linked to that the fact that I think in no country on earth energy is a real free market. It's always regulated with licenses, monopolies. It's crony capitalism run wild. Or correct me if I'm wrong, but that's sort of my impression of how the energy markets operate almost everywhere, right?
Yeah, no, we're still in an infrastructure sector, and it would be naive to believe that you could do it just without any policy involved. But of course, it is. We have been driven in a wrong direction, in a relatively arrogant direction, to state these and those technologies, those we develop, and the other ones we don't. And in the up until the 1990s, I believe it was a relatively good level playing field. So all the technologies that were interesting got some funding. We had at the university level professorships for as a research positions for both solar and nuclear and combustion optimization of combustion power plants. So that I think we need to get back to this, and the real big issue is the Renewable Energy Directive, that essentially says that everyone has to go to so-called renewable, although it is essentially a synonym for weather dependent, and
Yes.
it's just not well thought through. I mean, it's weather dependent energies have two really big issues, and one is the low energy density, which means that you require lots of land and lots of commodities to harvest them. And the second is the intermittency, that you have to bridge somehow, and to believe that you could get rid of base load because the offering is not in a constant way. That is it's hilarious. I mean, it won't work like that.
And then also linked to that, not only do they want to impose as much renewable energy in the energy mix as they can, uh, I mean, they also assume this will then work, and then they can impose specific, kind of cars onto the car market. I mean, at the EU level, the idea is I don't think it's 100% finalized, this legislation, but to ban the combustion engine from 2035. And I believe a number of member states also have done it or are doing it at the national level. I mean, what's your view on that, on the electric car revolution? I'm not a car expert, but I think it's easy to come up with so many problems with it, electric cars. And again, let the market decide. Let people decide what they prefer, and if the downsides are maybe worth it compared to the upsides. It sounds to me so incredibly wrong to try to impose this.
Yeah, it stems from the same arrogance, essentially, to tell that the politicians believe they can tell the engineers where the best solutions are. And no, that's exactly the thinking. I mean, the electric cars. We don't need to go into this debate. I mean, I would love to have an electric car for whatever I do here around Frankfurt, but
Uh-huh.
usually I use my car mostly for long haul travel when I have to go to see someone. And so of course I stick with my old combustion engine propelled car. And that is so the market shares of electric vehicles are still very, very weak. So the two of us, we're not alone in believing that there might be some issues.
Yes.
And then again, it is something that is being done without even really considering the enormous challenges of building out the electrical grid in a way that people can charge their cars. So what is it's probably all over the Europe the same thing. We have in our streets cables of 85 kilowatt, and this can be upgraded to maximum 125 kilowatt. But one supercharger consumes half of that energy, 40 kilowatt, and some more. So if you live in that street and you're the first one to get a supercharger, lucky you. But the second one, essentially, they have to say, well, it can't work like that. Now we have to reinforce the grid, and they actually have to do it. They're obliged. But if everybody now buys an electric car because he's forced to, and wants to have a supercharger, it simply won't work. And these trillion of funds that need to be brought up to enhance the grid in such a way, and the distribution grid. It's mostly the question of the distribution grid, and then of course to build the new power plants fuel this, and they shouldn't be weather dependent, because people might wish to charge their electric car even on a cloudy winter day, so without wind. All of this, it's a refusal of the political space to ask the right question and to get them answered, and this is a general a lack of scientific thinking in the political space, and probably in the media, because they let the politicians get away with it.
Yes, yes, very very true. Maybe before we conclude, I have a question on the German manufacturing sector. There have been some alarmist media articles also this week in the Financial Times, highlighting how many German companies have already gone bust, bankrupt. Some of them 120, 150 years old, and all of it directly linked to the exploding cost of energy. What's your view on this? Are you very pessimistic? Do you think the government is not getting it right, is not basically following your suggestions? Will we have a very big crisis again next winter when trying to fuel or gas reserves? Or do you think that this is all a little bit exaggerated perhaps, and that somehow industry will find a way to cope with the challenges? I mean, as somebody who is actually, of course, a great expert also in the German economy, what's your view on this?
Yeah, this is a deeply economic question, and the observation is that in 100% of the cases when energy became very expensive, there was an economic crisis afterwards. So we sometimes tend to forget how important energy actually is, and the cheap and abundant energy is for our well-being as an economy and as a society. Um, we owe the fossil fuels a doubling in life expectancy. So we're getting older, richer, wealthier, better nourished than 200 years ago, our ancestors. And although we have increased the human population by a factor of 8, so this is very often forgotten, to whom we owe this, and that is fossil fuels.
Mm.
And every time they were cheap, that we had economic development, and every time they were expensive. For example, in 2007, when oil went up to above $140 per barrel, we had the most important world financial crisis. And of course, the high energy prices are not the root cause for such crisis, but they suck out so much cash out of the economy that
Yes.
vulnerable parts of the economy are then can't survive,
Mm.
and that is something we will see, and yeah, the the German policy. I mean, we have now made the first step towards a lifetime extension for 3 units, uh, for 3 months or 3.5 months.
Mm.
Is by far not enough.
Mm.
The liberals within the government, the FDP, will fight for keeping open as many power plants for as long a time possible. Unfortunately, now today, Christian Lindner, the head of the Liberal Party, said something that I can't really follow. He said, "Well, okay, we're going to use nuclear energy. We're going to use it for some as a bridge, and we are going to phase it out. But the bridge is good if you know what is on the other shore.
Yes.
But
Yes.
we are still developing. It's still in lab phase. What
Mm.
is on the other shore?"
Mm.
And to call nuclear a bridge is a little bit preposterous.
Mm.
So we need to reconsider all of these policies, and I don't see yet the readiness by industry leaders and by policy leaders so far. Meaning the energy crisis will prevail. We will have very high energy tariffs for the next probably 5 to 10 years, until we really are able to change something. And over that course, lots of industry will go broke.
Yes, well, that's let's say a reality shock then. And let's hope that this reality shock will force politicians and the commentariat to completely change their mind. I mean, there's a small glimmer of hope that Greta Thunberg, the great prophet of climate doom, has now openly come out in favor of nuclear power. And I think if people would listen more to you and actually how it's even able to ultimately replace gas, oil, even coal, then I think if you're a sincere environmentalist, there is no other conclusion possible than to embrace nuclear power. So thank you very much, Björn Peters.
Thank you, Peter.
The Brussels Report podcast.